Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for this sort of webinar and town hall informational session here on COVID-19 and the vaccine. We have just a wonderful friend of mine, one of my high school mates. In fact, she was valedictorian of our high school. And ironically enough, among our senior superlatives, Dr. Jayne Morgan and I were chosen as those possible best leaders in the future. And now here the two of us are together doing this webinar with you this evening. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a really fun time. She's smart as a whip, Dr. Morgan, as the clinical director there at Piedmont Healthcare and the COVID task force leader there. We're just honored and delighted to have you to be able to share with us this evening, give us some enlightenment about COVID-19. I mean, how long is it going to last? Is this new wave going to be a big threat? Why is it so important for us to be vaccinated? Can we trust the vaccine? People of color, particularly, are still dealing with some of the after effects of the Tuskegee experiment and all of the things that may have happened in history. So how do we overcome this? What does our future look like? When are we going to get back to normal? We've got so many questions, but I'm so incredibly pleased that Dr. Jayne Morgan is here to be able to give us some answers, make us think about some things, and maybe just capacitate us with this information that can put us at ease and help us make a better informed decision with the vaccine. So, Dr. Morgan, welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for the investment of your time, sharing with us, as I know that you've done with many, many different groups, but we're especially honored just to be able to have you to share with us tonight, share your brilliance, your knowledge, your expertise. And I know that you've received the vaccine. I've received my first dose and I'm supposed to get my second dose this week. So this is absolutely wonderful, wonderful timing. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Just greetings to us. Just go ahead and open and greet us however you want and just start sharing some information, and then we'll start unloading some other questions on you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bishop Bronner. I am so happy to be here. It's always a pleasure to reconnect with old friends, old high school classmates, and it just feels so warm. And actually, I'm tickled pink actually at seeing Bishop Bronner here. I know his wife, I know his wife's family, and I know Bishop Bronner's brothers, and so I really am honored to have this invitation, really, to be here today. And Piedmont is certainly working to develop a better relationship with the community and providing these vaccines to Word of Faith. So a little bit about me. I am a cardiologist, actually, by training, formerly trained cardiologist. I went to undergraduate here at Spelman College. I'm actually a native Atlanta and was born here in Atlanta. After Spelman, I went to medical school at Michigan State and then did an internal medicine residency at George Washington University before going on to do a cardiology fellowship and a pacemaker fellowship at Mount Sinai. So you might ask, well, how did you end up in vaccines and virology? I'm way off course. But I'll tell you, a couple of things happened, in life, and I started to become interested in research. Started out in cardiovascular research, went to work for drug companies after I practiced for a number of years, Solvay and Abbott, working in the cardiovascular space, later in the device space. And then came to Piedmont really to lead their cardiovascular research program and then strategy across research. And that began to branch out into other disciplines, oncology, pulmonary. And as I began to have more and more leadership, my expertise became broader. It was necessary to become broader. And so as we came into this COVID pandemic, I was asked to lead the COVID task force at Piedmont. I readily accepted. And so part of my job and part of my background that has been very, very helpful in leading the COVID task force is I used to work in pharma. I used to work in devices. I came out of R&D. I know exactly what this whole vaccine process is like. That's what I did. I led those trials. I developed those compounds. And so it turned out that I ended up being a good choice when we have vaccines that are coming out that people don't really understand well. What is messenger RNA? What are viral vectors? We don't understand how they were developed so quickly. What is that process like? How did this happen? And so, I'm actually in a very good place to answer those questions. So I'm just going to start with a little introduction. And then as Bishop Bronner said, you guys can just fire away questions. And if you don't have questions, I can just talk till the cows come home. I have a lot to say. So I'm just going to do just a little brief introduction, talk a little bit about the vaccine, a little bit about vaccine hesitancy, African-American population. Certainly, this vaccine represents the triumvirate, this triangle of three aspects of our culture and our experience here in America that this vaccine represents. One, it represents our somewhat tepid or tenuous relationship with the healthcare system. And what does that mean? It also brings into play our almost non-existent relationship with research. That comes to bear when we talk about these vaccines. And then the third part of that triangle, that triumvirate, is it brings in the United States government, with which we also have a historical uneasy relationship. The Tuskegee experiment was done with the US government. All types of social injustices and police brutality all occur under the US government, and particularly under this former federal government and White House that we had in the previous 4 years. There really was not a trusting, in fact, a fairly hostile relationship, and certainly an uneasy relationship. So all three of those come together to bring us this vaccine. So there should be no surprise that there's vaccine hesitancy. And in fact, oftentimes when we first started this, I called it vaccine neverency. And then you add in this messenger RNA. What does that even mean? What are they trying to do to me? RNA sounds like DNA. Aren't they both the same? Isn't this all genetics? Very hard to know the difference. In fact, many scientists even don't know the difference. And physicians, because after you learn it in medical school, we don't really do it. We don't really work with it again unless you're in research or unless you're going into genetics, right? We don't really deal with that type of DNA. Even as we're moving into precision medicine. And so it has been quite a learning curve. It should be no surprise to anyone that people have a lot of questions and a lot of hesitancy. And so I'm here to really begin to answer some of those questions. And so I'm going to just start before we open it up to everyone for questions regarding the data. And that's really, my background. I want to talk with you about the data. When we look at the FDA briefing documents that were submitted to the FDA from both Moderna, Pfizer, and also J&J, Johnson & Johnson now, when we read those documents, as I have, every single page and review that data, one thing that is interesting to note is that in the Moderna trial, 10.3% of those participants were African American. In the Pfizer trial, 9.8% of those participants were African American. And while we make up 13.4% of the population, these trials certainly fell short of representing where we are in this mosaic of America. But what we should understand is that by and large, we don't even participate in research and clinical trials because of all of the historical atrocities that I'm happy to go through in detail, different stories if you have questions about them and you've always wanted to hear the details. But for making this point, because of where we have been in history, we don't necessarily participate in clinical trials. In fact, we participate at around 3 or 4%. So for Pfizer and Moderna to be able to have 9.8% and 10.3% participation of African Americans in that trial, they were very intentional and very purposeful in recruiting Blacks into those trials. And so although it didn't represent the 13.4%, it represented about 10%. And when you talk about the number of people in those trials, Moderna had 30,000 people. Pfizer had 40,000. So we're talking about 70,000 people, of whom we made up 10% of that pool, more than 10%. So we're at more than 7,000 people. So I think when we look at that data that went to the FDA, we can feel confident that that data reflects us and that the data is relevant to our population. So when we talk about the safety of that data, and when we talk about the efficacy, meaning how well the vaccine actually works, that data includes us, which is rare. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about before we open it to questions is when you dig deeper into that data and look at the subpopulations within these trials, and specifically I looked at the African American population in the Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson trials. The African American population, while these vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, were at 94.5% efficacy, meaning how well they worked, and 95% efficacy. When I looked at the African American population, those participants in the trial, when they were measured 2 weeks following the second dose of their vaccine, there was 0% incidence of COVID-19 in the entire African American cohort 2 weeks following the second dose of that vaccine. What that means is, even though the vaccine was 94.5 or 95% efficacious, meaning how well it worked, in the Black population, it was 100%. So we should think about that when we're thinking about these vaccines. Lastly, I'll talk about Johnson & Johnson because we'll be bringing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and I want to make certain that I talk about it because you've noted probably, I don't know if you've been following it, that those efficacy numbers for Johnson & Johnson are less than they are for Moderna and Pfizer. So isn't this a worse vaccine or a weaker vaccine? Shouldn't I try to take the ones that have higher efficacy? And I'm going to talk with you about why that's not true and why we have to consider mutations and when these vaccines are trialed and what that means. And again, I want to talk about the 100% number in Johnson & Johnson that we need to think about that protects us. So I'll just stop there and see if there are any questions. And if not, I'll keep going.
Wow. That was certainly good to know about the efficacy rate among African Americans in the initial studies there with Pfizer and Moderna.
That's right.
I didn't know that, but I'm glad that makes me feel good.
Good.
It really, really does. So let me ask you, with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, does that one actually have antibodies of COVID itself, or is it the mRNA type vaccine as well?
So great question. So when we look at the Moderna and Pfizer, so all of these vaccines that are coming out, and more will come, are all going to be on scientific platforms. So our previous vaccines, when you talk about polio, chickenpox, these are vaccines that are actually live viruses that we either kill or we attenuate, meaning we weaken them or dilute them to the point that they're not strong enough to cause disease in our body, but their presence still stimulates our immune system to develop those antibodies. Those are live viruses. Those are the types of vaccines that we have always had. We have moved on to these new scientific platforms. Moderna and Pfizer were the first ones to introduce them in the United States with this messenger RNA. Then we moved to Johnson & Johnson, who's come out with viral vector vaccines, and we will see more viral vector vaccines coming out. After that, there will be these nucleic acid protein vaccines that come out. We have completely moved away. You can think about the old vaccines as like the old cars. And now we're in the new model of cars. And it's all going to be on scientific platforms. So let's talk about the three vaccines that we have. Messenger RNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, and then Johnson & Johnson viral vectors. Viral vector vaccines take a shell of an adenovirus. An adenovirus is a type of cold virus, like the common cold, but it's hollowed out. We only use the shell of it. And we use that shell to transport a piece of genetic material into your body that then codes for this messenger RNA, just like Moderna and Pfizer. And then the messenger RNA creates this protein. In this case, it's the spike protein. That's the key element of the COVID-19 virus that infects your body. And then once it codes that spike protein, your body recognizes it and makes the immune response. So in essence, Moderna and Pfizer work the exact same way as Johnson & Johnson. They just use different methods of introducing the messenger RNA. Pfizer, Moderna introduce it directly. J&J introduces it by a viral vector that then creates the messenger RNA.
Gotcha. Excellent. Excellent. Well.
So they're all much more similar than people, think. They sound differently, but it's still all kind of the same scientific process. And at some point, they still all come down to the same pathway. The end of the pathway is still the same when you're developing the protein.
And you mentioned, I know one of the things that I've heard so often during this, when the vaccine first came out, as part of the distrust, particularly in minority communities, they're wondering, like, how did they come out with this vaccine so fast?
Right.
So give us a little bit about the background information. How long has this type of technology, have they been researching this in the past? Has it been a matter of months or has it been years?
And so when we think about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, this is the virus that causes the disease that we know of as COVID-19. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus is so named with that number 2, that's an alert to the scientific community. Aha, this is the second time we're seeing this. When is the first time? The first time was in 2003. We had a SARS outbreak, severe acute respiratory syndrome. You may not remember it because at the time our pandemic response team globally was still in place, had not been disbanded. And we were able largely to keep that outbreak off our shores. However, it scared the scientific community because it was an airborne virus. And when we talk about airborne viruses, it's very hard to control air. It's very hard to deprive human beings of air. Our bodies require air to live. We breathe in and out 12 times a minute, every single minute, every hour, every day. We cannot avoid air. So when we have this airborne virus that first showed up in 2003, there was quite an alarm. We were concerned about it. Additionally, if this became a big outbreak, it would be very difficult to keep it out of the United States because why? It's transported by air. Very hard to contain free air. So the community began to very stridently study that SARS virus in a family of coronaviruses. By and large, we had a second outbreak of a family of viruses that was similar to it and gave us more information called the MERS outbreak, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, that by and large was contained to Saudi Arabia, but gave us our second signal that we have a problem. This was our second airborne virus coming out of this coronavirus family. So the scientific community was quite alert. And so between 2003 and 2020, when we had our first case of COVID-19 here in the United States, we had completed 17 years of study on that.
Wow.
We had completed all the preclinical work, all the bench work research, had identified the entire genomic sequence, all 30,000 base pairs, and analyzed them, had identified the spike protein as the key vehicle via which it connects and attacks our bodies by connecting to a receptor called the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor. We had even identified that receptor. All of that work was done in those 17 years before we ever had our first case. So when we start to develop these vaccines, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came with 17 years of research.
Wow.
Additionally, at the same time, the technology of messenger RNA had been worked on. In fact, we've been working on it for 30 years. One of the reasons we've never been able to put it into a vaccine is that it denatures or disappears quickly in our bodies. It doesn't stick around. And
Wow.
so we had difficulty figuring out how to make it stick around long enough to code for this protein before it disappears. So
Gotcha.
lots and lots and lots of work had been going on. And then
Good.
the final thing that I will say, which is where my background comes in as well, is that the drug development process generally occurs in 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. You don't start phase 2 until you end phase 1. You don't start phase 3 until you end phase 2. And not only that, you end it, you analyze all the data, you submit it to the FDA, you wait for a response, and then you start phase 2. So it takes years to do this.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
we decided this time was to accelerate that model, and we stacked the phases. Before phase 1 ended, we looked at the data. If it was looking good, trending in the right direction, we took a risk and went ahead and started phase 2. And then we did an interim analysis in phase 2. If that data looked good, we took the risk and we started phase 3. The reason we were able to do that is because of virtually unlimited resources, meaning money, now pouring into this development process when the World Health Organization declared it to be a pandemic. The reason drug companies don't do that because of that word risk that I used.
Yes.
If the data doesn't look good, they now have poured millions of dollars to start another phase for a drug that they're not going to take to market. So they never do that. They don't want to waste their money.
Sure.
And so if you have unlimited resources, you can do a lot of things. You can hire more scientists. You can pull key people from other projects. You can stop other projects and green light only this one. You can open more study sites, enroll people more quickly, close your trials. You can do a lot with money.
Yes.
And that's what we see with unlimited resources. And then finally, don't forget, this is not under FDA approval, which would have required another 1 to 2 years of immunity data. This is emergency use authorization, meaning that the safety data looked good, the efficacy data looked good, and the recognition that we were in an emergency and no other viable therapies were available to our population. So the FDA grants it under emergency use authorization. Without that, we would still have to wait another 1 to 2 years. So that's how all of this was accelerated without compromise to safety.
Good. Excellent. Good to know. Here's a question here. Do I have to stop taking allergy shots to get the COVID shot?
Absolutely not. Please take all of your medications, including your allergy shots. Continue to take them. And while we're talking about allergies, once again, these are not your live viruses, these are not the live virus vaccines, the vaccines of yesterday. This is messenger RNA viral vector technology. So the allergies to the previous vaccines as well, I know that's not the question, but since we brought up allergies, I'm just going to talk about it, don't apply. So that means if you have allergies, whatever, to venom or bee stings or environmental allergies or hay fever or eggs or chicken or whatever you have an allergy to, that doesn't apply here. This is a scientific technology. You're not allergic to it. So you can move forward with this vaccine. The one contraindication is one of the ingredients in the vaccines that is a lipid or a fat. And it's called polysorbate or polyethylene glycol. You would know you are allergic to it because it's commonly found in stool softeners or laxatives like Go Lightly or Miralax or Colace. So if you've ever had a reaction to a stool softener or a laxative, that could probably be a contraindication to this vaccine. That is the only one. And that is not, that is really just a lipid or a fat. But if you've had a reaction, you certainly have to let us know. But remember, this is not a live organism or virus. This is technology. So you're not allergic to it.
Sure. Good, good. Here's another question. Is it advisable for women trying to get pregnant to get the COVID shot now, or should they wait until more adjustments have been done to the vaccine?
So what we're hearing from the CDC, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, ACOG, and the World Health Organization, as well as other prominent leaders that are OBGYNs, obstetricians, and gynecologists, is that we are recommending that all pregnant women move forward with this vaccine. The reason for that is twofold. One, there is absolutely no evidence nor any reason, scientific reason, that a messenger RNA vaccine or a viral vector vaccine should impede fertility or impede reproduction in any way. There's no scientific reason for that. Number two, pregnant women who contract COVID have a much more deleterious or serious event, and their outcomes and complications are much greater, a much greater risk than we want to see any woman take with her child. So we want to make certain that you are protected with these vaccines. Finally, if you do receive the vaccine and you're pregnant, your passive antibodies pass through the placenta and the umbilical cord to protect your baby as well, being born into a world that's in the middle of a pandemic.
Well, that's good. Someone else said they have a question about the long-term effects that have not shown up in studies.
Right. So long haul syndrome, and I think this is what you're talking about. If not, feel free to ask your question again. So there's something called long haul syndrome. And long haul syndrome is patients who've had COVID-19 and recovered. And then weeks or months later, they began to get sick again in non-specific ways: chronic fatigue, headaches, brain fog, disorientation, difficulty with memory, difficulty with taste and smell, more serious things like chronic inflammation of your heart, inflammation of your lungs. That's called long haul syndrome. We see that in 30% of all patients who've had COVID-19, regardless of the severity of your disease. So you could have been critically ill in the hospital for 2 months, intubated in the intensive care unit, or you could have been pretty healthy, asymptomatic, meaning you have no symptoms, and you were at home and largely you played video games and marked your calendar till you were free in 14 days. So you were kind of trapped but ready to get out. Both of those patients have the same risk of developing long haul syndrome. And so what's so catastrophic is when we talk with people and they say, you know what, I'm just going to get COVID. My friend got it. They didn't have a lot of symptoms, or I don't think I'm going to have symptoms. I'm pretty healthy, so I'll just get the COVID and it'll be fine. You know, and you might be right. You can get COVID and be very asymptomatic and feel relatively well. What we don't know is if you'll be one of the 30% of people who are sick later.
Wow.
And so that's another reason to get the COVID vaccine, to not only protect yourself from COVID-19, but to protect yourself from long haul syndrome as well. We can't identify it. We can't predict who's going to have it. It cuts across all races, cuts across gender, cuts across socioeconomic, it cuts across status of health, it cuts across severity of your disease, it cuts across geography. We have no way to identify or predict who will go forward to develop this long haul syndrome.
Wow.
So we want to encourage you to take the vaccine because it protects you not only from COVID-19, but it protects you from developing these long, lingering, often debilitating symptoms of long haul syndrome.
Well, good, good. Someone asked, what's in the vaccine and do you have to get a booster after?
So the ingredients of the vaccine, I'll start with Moderna and Pfizer, just to give you, a complete picture of it. So we've got the polyethylene glycol or the polysorbate. And so these are hydroxybutyryl is another, diacylstilbestrol. These are all types of lipids or fats. Okay. Then we have sodium phosphate, sodium chloride, potassium phosphate, potassium chloride. These are types of electrolytes or salts. And then we have sucrose. It's a type of sugar, however you want to pronounce it. So essentially, Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines are made up of fats, salts, and sugar. And the messenger RNA floats inside of that emulsion. Moderna has an additional ingredient called tromethamine, which is used just to balance the acidity of their solution. And remember, Moderna has different refrigeration requirements, not as stringent as Pfizer. Johnson & Johnson is very similar. They add citric acid to theirs. And those are, by and large, the components of the vaccine, fairly natural components that are really just used as an emulsion to carry the viral vector or messenger RNA into your bodies.
Wow, good. Do we know how long the vaccine provides protection?
So when I talk about the FDA not granting approval, but approving it under emergency use authorization, the reason that they did that is because they did not have all of the data to qualify for a full FDA approval. So what data did they have? They had all the safety data requirement. They had all the efficacy data, again, meaning how well it works. What they didn't have was the immunity data. So what immunity data did they have? They required 60 days of immunity data from all of the companies before they would move forward with emergency use authorization. So when each vaccine was approved under EUA, emergency use authorization, we knew that you have 60 days of immunity.
Gotcha.
We now are continuing to follow these patients. Remember, 70,000 between Pfizer and Moderna, another 40,000 in the Johnson & Johnson trial, which I haven't discussed yet. We're following these patients out. Every single month, we measure their viral titers and see if they have immunity. This is all the work that's generally done such that you can have FDA approval. But since we're in a pandemic and we're under emergency use authorization, it's literally happening in real time. So at this point, we probably have 5 or 6 months of data, and we know that it provides immunity. Next month, we'll have 7 months of data. The month after that, we'll have 8 months of data. Month after that, we'll have 9 months of data. So we're all in this in real time. So stay tuned. We don't know yet, but it could be an annual booster or like the flu shot, or it may turn out that it provides, protection for a long period of time. That's the part of the FDA approval that we were lacking, which is why we're under emergency use authorization. We don't know how long it lasts. We know it works. We don't know how long.
Gotcha. Excellent.
Yeah.
We do know about some of the risk of COVID for individuals that have pre-existing conditions. Here's a question says that if you are a diabetic and have psoriasis and a 60-year-old male, can you take the vaccine?
Absolutely. And this vaccine is for you. So let me talk again about the data. When we look at the data in these trials, so, 30,000 Moderna, 40,000 in Pfizer, 40,000 in J&J, these vaccines, these trials included thousands of diabetics. So about 17 or 1,800 in the Johnson & Johnson, maybe 3,000 in the Pfizer, another 1,600 or 1,700 in the Moderna trials. All patients with psoriasis. We have patients with significant heart disease, about 1,700 patients. Patients with significant lung disease, another 1,700 patients. Patients with hypertension, patients with all forms of cancer. So we need to, when we think about including, and also patients, HIV disease, 176 patients, liver disease, 370 something patients. So the point that I'm making is that even though these vaccine trials did not specifically study these specific conditions, they also did not exclude them. Yeah. Everybody was allowed in regardless of your health status.
Yes, sure.
So all of that was included. And so we absolutely want to encourage people who have comorbidities, which is our term for a chronic medical condition that you are managing and living with, including diabetes, to step up and take these vaccines. For example, I'm a cardiologist. If you have a history of heart disease and you contract COVID-19, you're 6 times more likely to be hospitalized than someone who contracts COVID-19 without cardiovascular disease. If you are hospitalized, you are 12 times more likely to die than another person with COVID-19 in our hospital who does not have cardiovascular disease. So chronic medical conditions can make you more susceptible to disease with more complications and a more complicated hospital course. So we absolutely want people with chronic medical conditions, the so-called comorbidities, you might hear that word, to step up and take the vaccine to protect your health.
Yeah, good. Here's another good question. I've heard this asked a lot. If someone believes that they've already had a mild case of COVID-19, aren't there antibodies in their system? And if so, is it still necessary for them to get the vaccine?
So if you had COVID-19, I'm going to just circle back to the question I just answered. In those trials, by the way, they also included people who had also had COVID-19. So they were also in the trials. So now I'm going to answer the question. If you've had COVID-19, we still want you to take the vaccine because beyond 90 days, it's unclear how long your natural immunity will last. We have noted that some people seem to have no immunity after 90 days. Some do, some don't. We can't predict. So it's unclear. You're in foggy territory 90 days after your COVID-19. So we want everybody to get the vaccine to protect yourself. The other thing that I will bring up is if during the course of your COVID-19 disease, you received convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibody therapy, and you would know that because those are given as outpatient treatment, so you're not in the hospital, and they also are IV, intravenous. They have to put a needle in your arm and have a bag of fluid running into you, so you probably would remember that. If you were treated with convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibody therapy, then you must wait 90 days from those infusions before you can get the vaccine. And those questions will be asked. They should be. Those questions should be asked if you show up for a vaccine. We ask if you've had convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibody therapy.
Well, good, good. Here's another question. Is the data only focusing on adults? And then they ask, what about young adults and teens when it comes to taking the shot?
So the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines only focused on adults, patients 18 years of age and older. And so those two vaccines have emergency use authorization only on those populations that they studied, and they studied 18 and older. Pfizer received emergency use authorization also for 16 and 17-year-olds because they included that population in their trials. So Pfizer is the only vaccine currently where a 16-year-old or 17-year-old can be immunized. Okay. Pfizer has just completed 3,000 children enrolled, I believe, ages 12 to 16. They just completed enrollment of that trial. They are also looking at younger age groups, the same for Moderna, the same for Johnson & Johnson. These are called bridging down trials. And so they don't take as long. And what that means in a nutshell is that all of the research and data has been done on adults, and we know that it's safe. So we don't have to do all of the work again for children. We then take that information and apply it to children in incremental younger stages. So generally we start ages 15 to 18, and then we go 12 to 15, and then we go 9 to 12 and 6 to 9. That's called bridging down. And each group, if it's okay, we go to the next group. Those are called bridging down trials. And as you can imagine, the younger the group is, the harder it is to enroll in a trial. And especially think about enrolling children in a trial that requires needles. Very, very difficult. Not only for the child, parents don't usually want to subject their children to things like that, with the exception of if the child is ill or if the child is suffering from a medical condition that clinical trial is trying to study and they can receive some benefit from it. And I think we see that as well in COVID. People are concerned that their children are not protected or their children have chronic conditions that they're managing. They have cystic fibrosis, and so they want their children in the trial such that they have access to this vaccine earlier. Wow,
good. Since you're a cardiologist, and here's another a question here that is it true that certain blood pressure medications are associated with a higher likelihood of death among those with underlying conditions who contract COVID?
So I don't know about blood pressure medication. So I'm not going to say no, but I will look into that. But I am not familiar with that at all. What I will tell you, which is what I think you're getting at, is that if you have high blood pressure, uncontrolled high blood pressure or poorly controlled high blood pressure, you are at increased risk if you are not taking your medications correctly and your blood pressure is poorly controlled. You're at increased risk of having a cardiac event, meaning a heart attack or some other cardiac complication if you contract COVID-19 and are hospitalized, if you're sick enough to be hospitalized. So please take your blood pressure medications. I know of no contraindications to a single blood pressure medication with COVID-19 or with the vaccines. In fact, we want you to control your blood pressure because without it and you become sick, if you're hospitalized, you have a much greater risk of serious complications from your heart.
Good. Some folks are concerned about the side effects of the actual vaccine. Can you share a little information about what are some of the common side effects that individuals have and what they could expect there?
So the side effect profile is very similar to the flu vaccine with one exception that I'll talk about. Common side effects. We have, nausea, vomiting, headaches, fever, chills, myalgias, meaning those muscle aches, pain in your deltoid, which is your upper arm where you receive the injection, and stiffness. So those are common symptoms that you have, very similar to the flu. If you're receiving one of the two-dose regimens, your second shot often elicits stronger, more severe symptoms than the first shot. Not for everybody, but some people will have stronger symptoms after the second shot. I received 2 doses of Moderna. I was vaccinated early when they were vaccinating, all the physicians and hospital workers in front line. So I received the Moderna vaccine. And after the first shot, I had really just arm stiffness. I'm also a Pilates instructor. I was able to teach my classes. I really didn't have any disability. It was just a little stiff, a little sore. After the second shot, I really had a lot of stiffness and soreness. I also had those myalgias in the form of lower back pain. And I was really restless at night. My arm was hurting, my back was hurting. So the second night I got up to take some Motrin, which I took, and 20 minutes later, I broke out into a sweat, which let me know that I also had a fever that the Motrin had just broken. I had headaches 2 days in a row, 2 mornings actually, that resolved with aspirin. And those are my symptoms. I probably had symptoms for 3 or 4 days. They did not concern me. I was not alarmed. In fact, I was heartened to know that my immune system was working and that it was revving up like a car getting started. Dr. Morgan, we haven't started this immune system in a while. And you're going to feel it. Many people will feel that. The older you are, the less likely you are to experience symptoms. Greater than 65 years old, greater than 55 years old, the younger you are, the more likely you are to experience symptoms. So it just depends on where you are. And of course, that's not a panacea. That's just general data information coming out of those FDA briefing documents. If you have no reaction at all, I don't want you to be concerned. It doesn't mean, oh my gosh, I think they didn't give me the real vaccine. I don't think anything's working. No, it just means that you're one of those lucky ones. In Spanish, we call them afortunados. You're one of those lucky people who just isn't going to feel it. Everybody's immune system works differently. And don't forget, even though people talk about a lot of the side effects, you hear the people who are making noise. Most people don't have side effects. You don't hear from them, but a lot of people do. And I did. Nothing that alarmed me. I didn't miss any days from work, but I've heard people say that they'd gotten the vaccine and they slept for 2 days. So, that might be you, that might not, but I think you should not be concerned.
Good. Wow. Here's a question.
One other thing, I'm sorry, Bishop Bronner, that I do want to bring up, I forgot, you guys are not getting this vaccine, but the Moderna vaccine, because I'm trying to just give you good information that you can take to everybody. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, more so the Moderna, but the Pfizer as well, can cause something called lymphadenopathy. And what that means is swelling of your lymph nodes. And they're on the side of the body that you receive the injection. So sometimes under your arm, if you got it in your right arm, or the back of your neck, these cervical or axillary lymph nodes. And they can be alarming, especially in women, because you're concerned that you might have breast cancer. Generally, they resolve in 2 to 4 days. If they stay for longer than that, you should just chat with your doctor and let them know that you've had the vaccine. We are recommending that no one receive a screening mammogram prior to receiving their vaccine. That's Johnson & Johnson as well. We're recommending nobody receive a screening mammogram prior to the vaccine, just so that we don't cloud any diagnoses. And then we also don't want you to receive one 4 to 6 weeks after receiving either your Johnson & Johnson or your second dose, if it is safe for you. These are screening vaccines. If you have breast cancer or you've got symptoms and you need to have a mammogram, then you need to do what you have to do and move forward. But if you're just doing your annual screening mammogram, we ask that you delay it during the period that you're taking the vaccines, because if you develop a swollen lymph node, we don't want there to be a confusion about what that is. And it generally will resolve in 2 to 4 days.
Gotcha. Wow. Someone asked if my family ages range from 55 to 13. Everyone in the home is now eligible for a vaccine except my 13-year-old. What happens if we all take it? Will the 13-year-old get sick because he is not vaccinated being around us?
Yeah, so that it would be called a low-risk household. Everybody's vaccinated except one person. And so that person really has a little bit of herd immunity in their house. So the unvaccinated person is sort of protected by that herd that's vaccinated. Now, that would be only if the 13-year-old stayed in that house. If they're out and about, he certainly could be picking up risk elsewhere if he's not following public health measures by putting on a mask, washing your hands, practicing social distancing. But within that household, with everyone masked, with everyone vaccinated, they can all remove their mask. They can interact as normal, hug, kiss, interact with their masks off, because they are mostly vaccinated and in a low-risk household. All right. So we're talking about herd immunity.
Yes.
So, one of the things about herd immunity, let's just talk about what herd immunity is for a minute. So herd immunity is really a term that was coined at the turn of the 20th century. And it came from farmers, from cattle farmers. And they noted that their cows, if they became infected with certain diseases and didn't die, that for a certain percentage of them developed this immunity, then the entire herd was protected, even those that did not have the disease, like the calves. And they started to note this phenomenon and called it herd immunity. Scientists also understood that and adopted that in science when we started to talk about vaccine distribution, like way back when, smallpox vaccines, those types of things. So herd immunity now means that the entire population needs to get up to, at this point, probably 80 or 85% of either natural or vaccine immunization. And remember, we can't really count on natural immunization because people have been inconsistent with it. So if you're thinking, you know what, I'm just going to hang out, let everybody else get it, and then because they're immunized, I'll be protected. Here's what I'm going to talk with you about when we think about this. Children are a large part of our population. And don't forget, the vaccine is not approved for them.
Right.
So it's up to all of the adults to get immunized, because even if all of us get immunized, we still won't approach 80% of the entire population if we do our best at 100%.
Wow.
But that's the best that we can do to protect our children, because the children can't get immunized. So we can't afford to have you sit out, because all the kids are sitting out.
Yeah, wow.
Until we can get them immunized.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Here's a question saying, what extra additives are present in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, saying that they've heard that they have used embryonic cells and fetus cells in their vaccines.
So the fetal cells, it's a human germ cell line. So first I'm going to say, yes, that's true, but also no, it's not. So I'm going to explain what it is. So 2 aborted fetuses from about 35 years ago were used to develop a germ line. We call those cells that we use in developing all types of things, including vaccines. So you don't go back and continue to abort fetuses. The germ cell line derives from that. And we develop a lot of things. So I don't know if that makes a difference, but I just wanted to explain it, that was from 30 years ago. And what we're talking about now are cells that are used to develop them. They're called human embryonic cell line that's used to manufacture the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The same cell line is also used in Moderna and Pfizer in their development and discovery phase. So these are frequently used cell lines like the HeLa cells. You may have heard of those. Henrietta Lacks will use HeLa cells as well to develop all of these medicines and vaccines. So the answer is yes and no.
Gotcha. Here's a question here. What is being done to make sure that there is more equity in the distribution of the virus? They mentioned that the mass distribution in some areas are not as readily accessible. So you might want to talk about that.
Yeah. So here I am. That's what we're coming out to the community. We're coming out to churches. I'm doing this town hall tonight for free.
Yes.
Because I am concerned and I want to be engaged, and I want our people to have the best information and the best knowledge. And I consider myself to be at the top of my game. I'm leading the Piedmont Healthcare system. This is the largest healthcare system in the state of Georgia. Here's what we're doing. Here's what I'm leading Piedmont to do. We're going out to churches. The other thing that we need to do, and not necessarily Piedmont, but everybody in the community, is we need to make certain, and this is a responsibility of the hospitals, responsibility of government, that we can provide vaccine access within 5 miles of everybody's house, at least 90 to 95% of the population. We've had people coming to us, coming to these big medical centers. It's time for us to reverse that and go out to where the people are, where people live, where it's going to be convenient for them, where they work, where they breathe, where their communities are, where their families are. That's what this is about. We are going to be here in the community, work with you, be a partner with you. When I say we, I'm not even only talking about Piedmont. Piedmont, absolutely. But also other health systems will as well. The government will as well. The drug companies, when I say the drug companies, I mean the pharmacies will also be getting involved. The grocery stores and those pharmacies will be getting involved. And so you should see, especially within the next couple of weeks, more and more and more vaccination centers opening, hopefully in your neighborhoods. But that is the charge that I'm leading at Piedmont, and that is absolutely why I'm here tonight.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Here's a great question here. If my family and I are taking supplements to keep our immune system strong and we have no underlying health conditions, do we still need to get a vaccine?
Yeah, and you do need to get the vaccine. And the reason for that is we are unclear if you were to contract COVID, whether you would be one of those asymptomatic ones or whether you have a complicated course. Now, it sounds as if you might have a fairly uncomplicated course, maybe a little bit of discomfort, you would quarantine, but don't forget, we've got this other kind of little monster hanging in the back called long haul syndrome. Yeah. And you might feel great, and 4 months later, you might start to get sick. And these are long-term symptoms. We can't cure it. We don't know what it is. We can't fix it. Now, anecdotally, and I say that's a term in science that lets you know that I'm about to say something that has no scientific proof. So anecdotally, we are beginning to hear that people with long haul syndrome who are getting immunized are seeing their symptoms resolve. That's anecdotally. There's no scientific data that I can point to for that. This is what we're starting to hear from my colleagues and from patients. We're starting to hear this chatter.
Yeah, good. Wow. Someone asked, is there anyone who should not take the vaccine?
So the only person that I could think who should not have the vaccine would be, and you still would need to get the first dose, if you have a serious allergic reaction, meaning an anaphylactic reaction, that means a very serious life-threatening allergic reaction to the first shot, then you absolutely should not go forward with the second shot. Right. But you have to have a reaction to the vaccine itself. Or remember, if you know that you've had laxatives and stool softeners in the past and you're allergic to them, don't forget that those laxatives have fats in them. That same fat is used in this vaccine, polysorbitol, polyethylene glycol. So those would be the only two.
Yeah, good. Are you able to donate blood after getting the vaccine?
You can donate blood. You need to let them know that you've been vaccinated, and each blood bank has different requirements. So you need to let them know. They may have you wait, they may not. And so it just depends on where you are. That's a great question though.
Okay. Now,
answer.
Now, since about 1,000 of these doses are going to be made available to those of us through word of faith from Piedmont, do you want to give us any other information about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is available?
I do. I didn't realize the time had run out. So yes, I do.
Sure. Yeah.
So go ahead, Bishop Bronner.
No. I was just saying, go ahead and give us that information. I don't want our time to run out before you're able to share that.
So, one of the things I think sometimes that people are concerned with, and you saw the Detroit mayor refuse Johnson & Johnson with very little information, or information you didn't really fully understand, which this is why, you got to have people who understand science around you if you're talking about science, because you're looking at data and you're thinking that it means what it means in layman's terms, and it doesn't. So Moderna and Pfizer, you hear that they have this 94.5% and 95% efficacy. And then you look at Johnson & Johnson, and they say, well, in the United States, there was only 72% efficacy. And you say, well, I don't want that one. That was only 72. I want the good stuff over there. But here are a couple of things I want you to think about. One, the flu vaccine, which is available every year. I hope everybody's getting their flu shots, especially if you are managing chronic medical conditions. I hope you're getting your flu shot. The flu shot on any year never has an efficacy more than 62%. It's 48 to 62%. Best year. The FDA only requires an efficacy of 50% for approval. Johnson & Johnson did their trials in the UK, in Brazil, in South Africa. If none of those are ringing a bell, this is where all those new and virulent and more infectious mutations are. That's where they trialed their formulation. And so they trialed their formulation against mutations that didn't even exist when Moderna and Pfizer were doing their trials.
Wow.
So it's hard to compare. It's not comparing apples to apples. It's comparing apples to oranges. We really don't know how well Moderna and Pfizer might have done under the same circumstances. Johnson & Johnson, one thing you know about Johnson & Johnson is they've already been tested against these more virulent strains that are out there now. Moderna and Pfizer have not.
Wow.
The other thing that we will say about Johnson & Johnson, which is the key point for scientists, and again, this is this number that I like 100%, is that nobody, and I mean nobody, 100% effective, that had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was hospitalized.
Wow.
Nobody that received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and I mean zero, that means 100% survived, nobody died. So even if you get COVID, your course is mild. Not a single person in a trial of 40,000 people went to the hospital and nobody died. Those are the key points when scientists are looking at that the Detroit mayor didn't understand when he's looking at the data. He's like, oh, 72, 94, and he's just comparing them like he's in a math class. This is not math.
Wow.
This is statistics and science, very different. The trials were done under very different circumstances with different mutations circulating at the time of those trials. So we have to think about that. The last thing that I will lead you with, I talked about the percentage of Black patients in the Moderna and Pfizer trial. If you remember, 10.3% Moderna, 10.1% Moderna, 9.3% Pfizer. And we're 13.4% of the population here in the US. Johnson & Johnson has 13% Black people in their trial. I've never even seen a trial that had that many Black people in it. 13% out of 40,000. Now you can do the math if you want to just do some math. Additionally, if you count in the Africans that were also included in the trial, it was 19%. So again, I think we can be confident that the data that was submitted to the FDA and approved for emergency use authorization is relevant to you and me, to our population. And that's all that matters. That's what we want to hear.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That is absolutely excellent. I just want to thank you for the investment of your time in sharing, answering a lot of things. I mean, I had that same question about the, Johnson & Johnson's being so-called 72% effective,
Right.
Compared to Pfizer and Moderna. Thank you for clearing that up. I mean, information is powerful. It is liberating to us. I think that you've helped quite a few of us to settle our minds around this. Thank you for your expertise, just for your passion. But it's been in your DNA. You come from this legacy. Your mother, your grandmother. This goes way back for you. So you're making all of your ancestors absolutely proud. Thank you for what you're doing for the city of Atlanta. We're just blessed to have you as a native child of Atlanta, just like I am. We're so rare.
Thank you. And Bishop Bronner, you and I got the Moderna vaccine. The fact of the matter is, we don't know if it's going to protect us against the new mutations.
Right.
But we know that Johnson & Johnson provides protection, and that's why Moderna and Pfizer right now are working on a third formulation. So everyone who received Moderna and Pfizer may have a third shot in their future.
Wow.
Because they recognize that the current formulation wasn't trialed against these new mutations, but the Johnson & Johnson was.
Wow.
And against the new mutations, nobody died. Nobody. That's all we care about.
Wow. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That is good news. That's great news. That is absolutely great news. So again, we're really excited to be able to have that Johnson & Johnson vaccine available, 1,000 doses on April the 6th.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah, it's coming up. It's coming up. Wow.
And I'll be there. I'm happy to meet anybody there, answer questions. A lot of times after I do these, you can't think of questions at the time. And then later you have a question, you go, oh man, I wish I had asked that. Or you talk to somebody, you think of something. So I will be there on site as well on April 6th. Feel free to find me. I'll be walking around. I don't know what I'll be doing. Maybe I'll be giving vaccines. I'm not sure. But and I'm happy to answer questions and meet you as well.
Excellent. Well, fantastic. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Bronner. Thanks for inviting me. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.